Hello. If somehow you've come to this podcast cold and blind, you're listening to Patriarch, which is the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham by me, Colin Piper. You will, though, I think, need to go back and listen to the others first if you're to truly understand what this podcast is about and grasp the wonderful import of what's going on, because we've been exploring the failure and frailty of humanity. And now is revealed the faithfulness of God to the most insignificant of people, it would appear, who God reveals his love and grace in the most incredible way. Enjoy, and if you do enjoy, please do tell others about this podcast. Like the Facebook page, follow it on Podbean, and just generally make it known to your friends. We'd love to get it out there as widely as we possibly can. Thanks ever so much. Patriarch, Chapter 4, Part 4. Hagar had fallen on cushions, but the shock still stunned her. She hadn't been ready for the ferocity of Sarai's reaction, and she took a while to pick herself up before hurrying away, fearful of Sarai's return. For a while she hid, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. Over the past weeks, going to serve Sarai had become something of a game, sport. At first, she'd been deliberately vague over her periods and when or if they were due or overdue. Knowledge was power and fun. Then there had been the growth of her belly to taunt her poor mistress. She'd perfected a look which spoke of love and loyalty to all but Sarai, to whom they very deliberately said something very different. It was clever and fun. However, in the midst of it all, very occasionally, she would see her mistress and feel remorse for what was lost. Then it was sad and not much fun anymore. Now, in fact, it was no longer fun at all. She was just a dumb little servant girl again, with just one hope left. It wasn't until evening that Hagar finally plucked up the courage to return to Sarai's tent. But when she did, her spirits lifted. Sarai was sitting peacefully on her cushions. The cup which Hagar had brought earlier in the day still stood there, although Hagar noticed the spilt liquid had evaporated, leaving a stickiness around its base. The little girl stood hesitantly and awkwardly just inside the entrance to her mistress's tent and waited. Sarai seemed not to notice and sat studying some embroidery upon which she'd been engaged, then apparently became aware of her. She looked up and smiled. Hagar tried to smile back. She had hoped for some warmth from her mistress to encourage her apology, and surely this was it. Surely, but not assuredly. There was something not quite right about the smile. And Hagar couldn't respond in the way she had planned and wanted. "Hagar, where have you been? Look, the cup you spilt this morning is still here." Sarai smiled again. It was a smile which should have relaxed Hagar, and would have if it hadn't been for the darkness of Sarai's eyes which accompanied it. It was the darkness which gathered and preceded a storm, and Hagar involuntarily took a step back. "Where are you going, you stupid girl?" The smile was now sliding off her mistress's face to be replaced by a rage which terrified Hagar, because before that day she'd never seen it there before. "Come back and take the cup." But there was now no way Hagar could approach, and she continued to back off towards the door of the tent, which further enraged Sarai. It was time to teach Hagar the lesson that she was merely a maidservant and must obey her mistress. If she wouldn't come to the cup would go to her. And Sarai reached out, grabbed it, and swung her arm towards Hagar, releasing it awkwardly but by chance at the optimum trajectory and speed. It flew in an arch defined by the escaping remnants of the drink until when it hit Hagar, it was empty. The cup struck Hagar on the forehead, and blood immediately drew a line across her temple to reveal the place of impact. Hagar had no time to duck or defend herself, but instead stood impassively, almost fatalistically, awaiting the strike. Once hit, however, she moved fast. With an immediate scream, she ducked down and gripped her forehead. She didn't wait to see the blood on her hands, but threw herself towards the door, pushed herself out of it, and ran. She ran and ran, not back to her tent, but on and on to the very edge of the camp and beyond. She just kept running and running into the darkness, she knew not where. For once, the darkness didn't so much fuel fears, but provided refuge from them. Nothing there could be as fearsome as what it could hide her from. Eventually, she stopped running as her small, pregnant body could run no more, but she didn't stop fleeing. On she went through the night, still unaware of where she was or what direction she was going, apart from the fact that it was away from where she had been. Distance was all she worried about at that time. It was only as light broke through the darkness that Hagar took stock of where she might be or where she could go. If her life with Sarai was over, there was only one place for her to go. And taking her guidance from the position of the morning sun, headed southwest, back home. She did so with little conviction or hope. She was, after all, merely a maidservant and a pregnant one at that. She also had nothing with her, no food, and worst of all, no water. It was still cold, but Hagar knew it wouldn't stay this way. Suddenly, tiredness consumed her, but she was wise enough to know she couldn't afford the luxury of rest now. While it was still bearable, she went in search of water. Suddenly, her priorities had changed. Now they simply involved staying alive, a concept utterly unbelievable just 24 hours before. But as the sun and temperatures rose, Hagar's spirit and energy levels sank further. She had found no water. All she'd managed to find was a road along which she hoped to find, if not water, at least people, and hopefully of the merciful variety. But the road was deserted, except for an onager which ran across her path, and such was her desperation right then, even a wild donkey for a companion was like a gift from the gods. Oh, she wondered, not for the first time that morning, where she was taking her unborn child and why it was that no one else seemed to want to go there. She tried to distract herself from her misery with thoughts of her child, but the thoughts which came were not joyful ones she'd been thriving upon these past weeks. Now all she could think was whether her child or its descendants would have the opportunity to walk this road for themselves. Lower and lower her spirit spiraled until she was utterly incapable of any positive thought at all. All she saw spoke of death. Even the distant spring beside the road. At first Hagar had dismissed it as a mere mirage, and then when she found water, instead of feeling joy and relief, she almost resented it for perpetuating her misery. She would now live another day. Oh, but for what purpose? For the child? But who cared about the child? Not Sarai, who had turned on her, not Abram, who had been at best awkward when he'd been anywhere near her. Apparently not the gods. She doubted if anyone would come looking for her. If she died here and now where she lay, she doubted anyone would notice. And so she closed her eyes one last time on the world she knew and prepared to go who knew where. But someone was looking for her. someone she didn't know but who knew her intimately. Someone who did care, not just for the child, but for Hagar. Someone who would not only notice her death, but mourn it and would go any distance to prevent it. And he found her there, at the desert spring, by the road to Shur. When Hagar had given up on life, she had no idea or even care what her next experience or sight would be. Suddenly, just when she needed them most, her Egyptian beliefs in an afterlife deserted her, and she came to realize her gods were hers by inheritance rather than conviction, and by tradition rather than by experience. Until now they had served her well, but now she needed them, they were found wanting. She no longer had any interest in them, and if she had had the energy, she would have cursed them and died. As it was, she settled purely and simply for dying. However, a man woke her gently from her sleep, and as Hagar stirred in her weak, semi-conscious state, she sought to identify him, but she couldn't. He was a man she'd never met before, a stranger, but somehow familiar, like someone who'd travelled along the same road whilst not being part of her company. He was more than a man, a lord. And somehow more than that, but just how, Hagar couldn't make out. She was confused in the way that the midpoint between sleep and consciousness was confusing, but only more so because she was being called back not just from sleep, but even death itself. The man's first words were to confuse her even more. Hagar. He knew her. She may not know him, but he knew her. She, a maidservant, didn't know the Lord, but the Lord knew her. It shook her out of her lethargy and caused her heart to race again, but it was more than curiosity which aroused her. Blood pumped through her veins and her mind engaged. More than this, though, her spirit began to rise. It wasn't just that he knew her name, it was the way he said it. Hagar would never be able to describe how her name was spoken that day. It had never been uttered like that before, and would only once more be uttered like that again. Somehow it was the voice of love, complete love. It was both beautiful but frightening at the same time. Beautiful because it seemed to be able to penetrate the very depths of Hagar's heart and speak hope and belief into it. Frightening because it appeared nothing in her heart could be hidden from its reach. How could perfect love cope with what it would find there? Servant of Sarai. He knew her. He knew who she truly was. There could be no pretense. All the aspirations and delusions of grandeur which she had allowed herself to dream up and believe over the past weeks were swept away. And yet even in this there was hope. In truth, her dreams died with her flight. These words merely confirmed their demise, and yet they were not destructive, negative words. They didn't so much put her down back in her rightful place, but rather they spoke into her who she truly was. They somehow brought dignity rather than crushing it. They gave her a security to answer honestly the question she was about to be asked. Where have you come from, and where are you going? Hagar could have gone into detail about her abusive mistress and how she'd been wronged. To anyone else she would have done, but not to this man. It wasn't just that he evidently knew the answer to his question anyway, it was that he knew and loved her. He said her name and reminded her who she really was. He told her the truth and gave her the confidence to own up to it. I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered to the first part of the question. She knew as she spoke that she was admitting a serious offence, and yet didn't feel the need to justify or excuse herself before this man. He heard her and somehow made it right again, though she didn't know how. All she knew was his love. It was as though her answer, her confession, had opened a door, but to where she still had no idea. In fact, if anything, at first hearing, the answer the man gave was both disappointing and frightening. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. The second part of his original question, the part she had no answer for, he had answered himself. He directed her, even if it was along a path she feared to tread. And yet, as he spoke, she knew it was right. It should have been unthinkable and utterly undesirable to go back to the abuse. But more than that, to go back to being the humble, submissive servant she used to be. She couldn't do it, but as he spoke the command, she knew it could be done. It would not only be right, it would be all right. Things weren't turning out as she had imagined or dreamed they would be, but Hagar found herself trusting this man. In just a few brief moments, her heart had been restored and her mind changed, and the man knew it, and now seemed able to reveal more of what lay behind the door. I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. Oh, Hagar didn't doubt the man for a moment, which in the light of the promise was remarkable. She was, though, coming to a conclusion about him. It was something about the way he said those words, I will. And anyway, it was a promise Hagar had heard before. In the early days after Sarai had told Hagar of her plan, she'd spoken of promises like this one. They were promises that her God had made, but they'd been too much for Hagar to comprehend at the time. All she could see was one child, and beyond that it was a haze. But as ever, this man seemed to know this and spoke into her heart and mind just what she was able to comprehend and needed and wanted to hear. You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. God had heard her. He had told her that he'd heard her, and her child, her son, was testimony to the fact. Joy overwhelmed her soul and energy her body. She was alive again. Her misery was gone, and nothing could bring it back. Not even the man's words which followed. He will be a wild donkey of a man. She registered them and would return to them later, but right now could only reflect upon the man who stood before her and told her how God had heard her. Apparently God had heard her as surely as this man had heard her. And slowly the truth about the man dawned within her. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Oh, but God hadn't just heard her as this man heard her. He'd seen her as this man had seen her. In fact, he'd seen her as clearly as she had seen the man, and in him, God. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. To which all she could now say to the angel of the Lord who stood before her was, You are Yahweh, who sees me, for I have now seen the one who sees me. On uttering the words, Hagar knew a peace and a worth flood through her being, far greater than that of carrying the patriarch's child. It was the sort of peace and worth knowable by maidservants and patriarchs alike, and nothing would ever be the same again. The woman who prepared to leave the desert spring was unrecognizable in every way from the girl who'd come there to die. She took one last look around at the place where she met her God, to fix it in her mind's eye. She would carry it everywhere with her to remind herself of this pivotal moment in her life. And yet she still had no idea where this place might be. If it had no name, she decided she would give it one. Later, she was to tell Ishmael its name, and he would pass it on to her children, who would return along this road and make their home there, at Beer Lahai Roi, or the well of the living one who sees me.
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.